Hello everyone and welcome to the first Electrical Safety in Rental Properties webinar for today. I welcome you all. Thanks for joining us. My name is Chris Bombolis. I'm from the Office of Industrial Relations and the ESO just happens to fall under that umbrella. So we are proud to present you the Electrical Safety in Rental Properties webinar for the very first time. Now, throughout today's webinar, if you have any questions for our speakers, and we've got two of them a little later on, and there's also a panel session so we can get stuck into those questions, ask them at any time by typing in your name and question in the chat box that you can see on your screens. This is at any time during the live stream, and we'll ask them during the panel session a little later on during our webinar. You can also change the size of your screen to full screen by selecting the four small arrows next to the volume bar at the bottom of your screen. So you're in total control of what's happening here today. There are, of course, a range of legal responsibilities that landlords and property managers must follow to ensure that rental property is electrically safe. Whether now that's a house, a unit, duplex, granny flat, shed or townhouse. Today, we'll hear about these legal obligations from Michael Thompson from the Electrical Safety Office and Paul Waltham, who will give us another side of the equation, and he's from the Office of the Work, Health and Safety Prosecutor. Firstly, though, we need an official welcome, and I'd like to call to the microphone Donna Heelan, and she's the Executive Director of the Electrical Safety Office, and she'll officially kickstart our first ever Electrical Safety in Rental Properties webinar.
Thanks, Chris. Firstly, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet, and elders past and present and emerging. I'd also like to thank our speakers, Michael Thompson, who's a Principal Advisor and Licensed Electrical Worker with the Electrical Safety Office, and Paul Waltham, Barrister with the Independent Office of the Work, Health and Safety Prosecutor. I would also like to acknowledge the members of the Affected Families Committee that are joining us today, and everyone else that's taken the time to log on and join us for this important safety message. This webinar focuses on a very serious issue: electrical safety in rental properties across Queensland. As Chris mentioned, this can come in many different forms, from a shed to a granny flat to a duplex, and includes commercial buildings as well. Tragically, in the past 18 months, we've seen a young man lose his life in an incident in a rental property in Queensland. And sadly, prior to that, there were two other incidents, one involving a young lady in a rental property and the other an incident in a commercial premises. Often these tragedies involve contact with faulty or damaged electrical appliances or equipment that has not been properly maintained. That's why it's important that we have events like today's to improve electrical safety and to address issues which need our urgent attention. Our attention is not only urgent today, but to make sure we've got systems in place to make sure that things are checked on a regular basis. As you are aware, so much risk can be avoided by taking very basic steps. Yet sadly, Queenslanders continue to be severely injured or lose their lives as a result of receiving an electric shock at home. In my previous role, I managed the coronial unit, and I had first-hand experience of how these fatalities can affect families, friends, employers and workmates. This impact has an enormous, lifelong ripple effect. And though we are often reluctant, we really do need to talk about these tragedies and share the stories, because every time we do, if just one person goes home and tests their safety switch to make sure it works, if just one person calls their real estate agent to make sure they have systems in place to check and regularly maintain electrical equipment, if just one person installs safety switches on all circuits, and if one person tells one more person, then we will create our own positive ripple effect, which can prevent serious injury or death. The people who died were just doing simple things in and around their homes or commercial properties. They were digging a hole in the garden, they were pruning or cutting trees, they were working in or around with submersible water pumps, or they were coming into contact with something as simple as a hot water system. The Electrical Safety Office runs safety campaigns which promotes the dangers of working in ceiling spaces, the importance about regular housekeeping for electrical work, the critical important issue of making sure you only use registered electrical contractors in your properties, and installing safety switches on all your circuits. We want to get these important messages out to the community and to get everyone thinking and living safely around electricity. Make no mistake, electricity is an invisible and silent killer, and it rarely gives a second chance. I congratulate each of you for joining us today, but this is just the very first step. Simply attending is not enough. We all need to make a commitment to ensure that our rental properties, our own homes, our workplaces, our businesses and their occupants are free from death, injury and destruction from electricity. Please take steps today to do your bit in this important message, and please continue sharing the message and the lessons that you learned from here this morning. Together, we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Appreciate those messages. And one of the important ones that I gleaned from that, and I don't know about you guys, but it is that risk can be avoided by taking simple steps and to commit to taking those steps. It's not just about saying I am going to commit, but it is about committing. So thank you, Donna, and I hope your organisation continues to spread the messages about electrical safety. Speaking about electrical safety, I would encourage you guys, if you've already got questions, again, at any time, you can see it on your screens, you can join us and submit your questions. It's really easy. You just need to type your name and question in the chat box on the right of the screen. I'd now like to welcome Michael Thompson, who will be discussing electrical safety issues for rental properties. Thanks, Mike.
Great, thank you, Chris. Thank you, Donna. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. This is a very important topic that the Electrical Safety Office would like to promote a lot more. Unfortunately, it's usually not in the forefront of most people's minds, especially landlords and agents, I guess, about the electrical safety of their properties. So today would be all about us giving you a bit of a guidance on where you should be looking and what you should be doing to make sure that they are electrically safe and that you protect the people that attend these properties as well. So that's not only your tenants, but any workers who attend there as well, even the actual agents themselves. So it's very important that these are considered and remembered and move forward with it. So obviously safety switches is a very important one for us. Everyone would know that with the Electrical Safety Office. We are a big advocate for safety switches. So what are they? So a safety switch is a bit different to a circuit breaker. It protects people from electrical shock. So it will shut the power off on the circuit that it belongs to when a fault occurs across it. Now, a bit different to what the circuit breaker does. A circuit breaker will protect your equipment, but the safety switch will protect you yourself. So they're very important. They'll shut it off in milliseconds, so and stop someone receiving a fatal shock. Domestic rental properties, they must have safety switches fitted to all power point circuits as a minimum. So that is a requirement under law, under legislation, which Paul will discuss further. But as the Electrical Safety Office, we are big advocates for circuits to protected, all circuits protected by a safety switch. The new wiring rules, which is the electrician's handbook basically, says on new installations as required now. But retrospectively, we would like to see them across all circuits, because that way you can adequately protect all circuits and all people, even your hardwired equipment such as hot water systems as well, not just your power points and lighting. So that's what we'd like to definitely promote in the future. So testing your safety switches. So this is very important. So you may have safety switches installed, but how do you know they are working? That is the thing. We have actually found safety switches that do not work. So they're installed, but they do not actually operate. So these are things that you need to check and make sure they're okay. So it should be done at regular intervals. So the push button test, we suggest that it is done every 3 months. Now the 3 months comes when you get your power bill. It's a good reminder that you go test your safety switch. And this has to be obviously the responsibility of the tenant, not necessarily landlords, but give them that information. I think it's about them understanding that it's about their safety and about protecting them. And I suppose all the information regarding the power go off and whatever it may be and what they're connected to. But it's very important that they're tested to make sure that they are actually operating. Now, an operation and time test done by an electrical contractor at intervals as well is necessary. We consider it to be very important as well to make sure that it is tripping or turning off at the correct intervals of current and also time. So what we suggest is, you have to get your smoke alarms tested every year. We suggest doing that at the same time, or getting your contractor who does your smoke alarm systems to actually test those safety switches at the same time. And that way you can sleep soundly to know that they are working. Tingles or shocks from metal fittings. Now this is a very important one. So if you've ever felt a tingle or a prick from the end of your finger from a tap or a metal object within the house, that is actually an electrical shock. So very important that you do not ignore that. It could actually become fatal. So there have been incidents where that has caused an electrocution. So if you ever get that, your tenants report it. It must be Energex, Ergon Energy or Essential Energy, depending on the region you're in, must be contacted immediately, and they will come out and test your property to make sure it's okay. If they find nothing wrong with their network, they will get an electrical contractor in, and they might be able to have a look at it as well, especially if it's an actual piece of equipment that's wired into your house. So, but yeah, do not ignore that. It is very dangerous, and it is very serious when that sort of stuff happens. So definitely contact one of those electricity entities. So they're not your retailer, they're your entity, so they're the ones who look after the distribution networks and power lines. So tingles or shocks from permanent appliances. This is slightly different. Could well be the same issue, but this is in reference to like ovens, hardwired equipment, light fittings, air conditioners, hot water systems, everything along those lines. So everything that's actually wired into your switchboard, not plug-in. Advise the tenant to stop using it immediately. So if they report that there's an issue with it and they've got a shock, please make sure that they stop using it immediately. Turn it off if they can, or don't even go near it, and contact a licensed electrical contractor or the one that you use straight away to come and test and inspect the equipment. Time is of an essence with these sort of things, so the longer that it remains a hazard, the more risk that there is someone may actually receive a serious shock or injury or even death from these appliances. So just make sure that you have a good system in place in the way that you, I suppose, respond to these reports from your tenants. DIY. Now this is a big one for us as well. Electrical work is licensed work, so can only be performed by a licensed electrical contractor. You cannot perform it yourself. It is not only dangerous, you may kill someone with faulty wiring, it's illegal and will most likely void your insurance. So if your house burns down or something along that line happens from faulty or negligent and incorrect electrical work that's done by other people other than electrical licensed contractor, then you most likely won't get paid out. So, but our key point is that it's very dangerous, and sometimes these, I suppose, faults won't occur straight away or aren't immediately visible. Unfortunately, electricity is invisible, so you don't know there's a problem until it actually happens, where an incident actually occurs. So make sure you get a licensed electrical contractor to do any work. So visit our website to check if they're actually licensed. We have a facility on our website for that, so you can search up their license number and they will tell you who they are and if they're licensed as well. Make sure they are, because there's a few that aren't. Equipment maintenance. This is very important. What I like to use equipment maintenance is like an analogy for cars. So we're happy to spend $10,000 on a car and get it serviced every year, 6 months, or whatever it may be, how many kilometres, but we never get our electrical equipment checked. So this is something in the mindset of people where out of sight, out of mind, so we don't really think about it too much. but you must have these things maintained, your electrical equipment that you supply. So even if it's plug-in equipment that you've supplied to their premises, you need to make sure that it's safe for your tenants or anyone else who goes onto that property. You have the obligation to maintain that. So we need to get them checked regularly just to make sure they're okay. So have a maintenance schedule. So if you're a property manager or a landlord or an agent, have a maintenance schedule for the property. That's what we recommend, and a process for electrical repairs. So that's a process on when it gets reported to you, that you have a go-to-O process that is solid, depending on the emergency as well. So whether it's a serious report, such as a shock, or if it's down the line. So have a good process in place. It makes things a lot easier, and also provide those guidelines to your tenants. So that way they understand the full process and who they are meant to report to and what the action they're meant to take. So that's the important thing. And once again, always use a licensed electrical contractor. I'm sure that most have set contractors, so just double check that they're licensed and contact them straight away. One I wanted to mention specifically is solar systems. This is really comes into play with what I just said about the cars. So we spend a lot of money on solar and batteries, but it goes on the roof. We don't really check it. We don't really look at it until the power bill comes in. And a lot of the time that's when people realise that maybe the system's not working the way it should because their power bill is not reduced as much as it should be if they've got a feed-in tariff. So that's a little bit too late, so that's after the fact. So they must be regularly checked and maintained. You know, these things are on the roof, especially in a Queensland environment. It's hot, it's a lot of UV, they're exposed to harsh climate, so they need to be checked regularly and maintained. Now, you're installing an electrician who's Clean Energy Council accredited, would have given you a maintenance schedule for the system. If they didn't, you need to contact them and talk to them about it because it is a requirement. They have to give you that schedule. And they will check the system to make sure it is performing and it is safe. So they have certain areas that they need to check. And you'll find that as well, that they need to be regularly maintained for that performance. So it's not only safety. If you want to maintain the performance of the system and get the best out of it, they need to be cleaned and maintained regularly as well. And once again, never do your own electrical maintenance. We don't want people getting on the roof looking at these things. Just remember, when the sun is out, these systems are generating power. So they're basically a power station. So be aware of that. Get a licensed person out who knows what they're doing. Clean Energy Council accredited, who's familiar with solar. Roof spaces. So this is a good one as well. You would have seen a few of our campaigns regarding this. We pushed it a lot over a few years. So they are very dangerous and they have hidden hazards. They're not only because they're dark, but you get like vermin that may have been up there, possums, rats, whatever it may be, you don't know. So always turn the power off before anyone enters. Even some of the older houses that have a lot of exposed fittings up top, so like light fittings that have exposed points, they shouldn't be there, but they are sometimes, as well as possibly conductive insulation. So be very aware that it's a dangerous place. Always turn the power off, and not only the main switch, but the hot water switch as well. A lot of people don't realise that the main switch does not turn off your hot water if they're on a separate tariff, so they have two different feeds. So you need to make sure that you turn the hot water switch off as well. And also be prepared that if you have overhead mains coming in, where your power lines come into your top, that it is live. The main switch does not turn those off as well. So if that runs through your roof space, it is still live in there as well. You do not want to come in contact with that if it's exposed or if it's been chewed by vermin or whatever it may be. And always prepare your tenants for that as well. So if something needs to happen where the power needs to be turned off, give them the heads up, let them know, especially if they've got special equipment or health equipment. They can charge their phones, do whatever, prepare meals, and go from there. So it's just the way to do it, and that way everyone is happy. Overhead and underground power lines. So as Donna said before, we've had some incidents around overheads. So simple things are just trimming power lines. Trimming trees around power lines. You know, that can be serious work. You've got to be aware of it is. There's actually, under legislation, requirements around how far you have to stay away from your overhead service line that comes into your house. So keep well away from them. And if you're going to do any work around them, be sure to check the requirements around the distances that you have to stay away from it. And the underground power lines, dial before you dig. So they should have a record of where they are. You don't want to be digging into a power line or underground service line or even your own electrical sub-circuits, because it costs a lot of money to fix them and it's also very dangerous. So, and just think ahead when you're planting those trees and gardens, so they're not growing up and into power lines or into your overheads and where they may be. So have a think about that. Always be prepared and just be aware above you. The purchase or sale of a property. So this is one that if you do buy a property, you should be probably informed of this anyhow. Your solicitor probably will tell you, but so the seller must provide a written notice to the purchaser to notify whether a safety switch is installed in the house. From our experience, there's not too many out there these days that do not have one installed on the power circuits as a minimum. But if the property has been in a possession for someone for a long time, before 2002 where it became mandatory through legislation, that it can happen. So every now and then that pops up, but they have to notify you whether one's installed, and the purchaser must within 3 months install an approved safety switch or switches on the installed power circuits. So 1 or 2, depending on how many circuits you've got for the power. So that is a requirement and you must do it. So just a bit of a heads up for if you're buying new properties or investment properties that you want to rent out, that you need to do that. Reporting. This is something that is not known too much about, I guess, that we find with incidents. So it is under legislation you must report unsafe and dangerous incidents to the ESO. So what we call them serious electrical incidents, or SEIs, or dangerous electrical events. They must be reported to us. It's mostly so we can, I suppose, have a bit of investigation, put something in place and find out what the cause of the issues were, and hopefully if there is a common problem or issue or fault, save others' lives. So, or if you had a near miss, they're pretty serious. So of course, so the unsafe and dangerous wiring or equipment, report that to us please. Unlicensed or illegal unlicensed to work. We definitely need to know about that. We need to know about these people that are risking people's lives and going out there and doing unsafe work, and those shocks or dangerous electrical incidents. So that's about it from me. We have a couple really good documents on our, or brochures on our website for guidance on these. So we have the Landlords version and we have the Tenants version. Now these are fantastic pieces of kit. They have all the relevant information in them that you need to know. They're a quick reference guide. I would actually suggest that you download both, but put the electrical safety and rental properties for your tenants in their pack. So when they first join, start their lease, that they have this reference here as well. And also that's a good time to also put in those procedures or contact points about who they should contact when there's electrical safety issues. I actually just wanted to touch on one more thing as well about buying a property. We always get building and pest inspections, but get an electrical safety check. How do you know that the installation is safe? So that's another thing as well. We really need to start pushing that and become a standard item. We don't really do it enough. It's just as important as the other two. So we need to make sure that it's done. That's a proper one too, so get a contractor to come out and do that. But if you want any more information, go to our website there. The address is right there. And download those, have a read, and don't just, I suppose, just listen to this, actually do something to respond to these requirements, because they are very important, and they're important for the safety of the people in your property. So if something happens to those people, is it something that you can live with? So, you know, these are very important. And electricity doesn't give second chances, unfortunately. So it's rare that it does. So serious injury or death does occur. So thank you very much, and yeah, hope you took something away from this that's of value. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Some great take-home advice for property owners, managers, those who are renting, and general electrical safety. So, I would encourage you all to visit the website, electricalsafety.qld.gov.au. These are the hard copies of the material that Tomo was talking about. They're available online, so you can go to the website and look up for these great pieces of resource that are available for you to use immediately in a online or a capacity that you can download and use at your place of work, at home, or in your rental property. That was one side of safety, electrical safety, and in rental properties. Now let's have a look at the other side, and Tomo touched on legal responsibilities. So we thought we would have a legal perspective. And again, if you've got, Tomo, I know there's a few questions for you when we get into the panel session a little later with you and Paul. Already lots of questions pouring in for you. I'm sure there'll be just as many for Paul from a legal perspective. So now time to hear from Paul Waltham. He is from the Office of the Work Health Safety Prosecutor to give us a legal perspective on electrical safety and the legal responsibilities for rental properties. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thank you to all of you for taking time out of your day to watch this webinar. I hope you'll take something away from it. I'm here today to talk to you about the legal requirements under the Electrical Safety Act for landlords and tenants. This can be very complex at times. Hopefully I can make it simple enough for you to follow. The duties and offences under the Electrical Safety Act are very similar to those that operate under the Work Health and Safety Act. You probably all heard of workplace health and safety. However, they are slightly different because the Work Health and Safety Act duties apply primarily to people or companies who are conducting businesses. The Electrical Safety Act duties, however, apply to a much wider range of people or companies than simply those conducting businesses. They can in fact apply to people who you ordinarily wouldn't expect as conducting businesses, such as your ordinary mum and dad who have one or two rental properties that they rent out for tenants to live in. The tenants themselves can also have duties under the Act. The main duty that would be owed by a landlord is as a person who is in control of electrical equipment, and we find that under Section 38 of the Act for anybody who's interested in looking up legal sections. So, who is the person in control of electrical equipment? It's the first question to ask. For a commercial tenancy, that would be the person who's the occupier of the place, generally the tenant, the commercial tenant. However, a commercial tenant can contract out to some other person to have control of the electrical equipment. That might apply, say for instance, in a large shopping centre. However, for premises that are occupied as a residence other than by the owner, the electrical equipment which forms part of the premises or is supplied for use at the premises, owned by the owner of the premises, the owner remains the person in control of the electric. You can't contract out of that obligation. You can't put it in your lease to pass that obligation on to the tenant. So the landlord will remain as a person in control of that electrical equipment. So what is electrical equipment? Electrical equipment will be all of the wires, the cables, the switchboards, socket outlets and light fittings that you'd normally find in a house property. It extends to the hardwired appliances, the ovens, cooktops, air conditioners, hot water systems, solar panels, inverters and batteries. But also it can apply to any plug-in appliances that are supplied by the landlord for use by the tenants. Fridges, freezers, washing machines, dryers, irons, all of that stuff that may be supplied, say, for a holiday rental or Airbnb. All of that equipment that's supplied by the landlord for use by the tenant comes under the banner of electrical equipment. So what is that duty that's owed by the landlord? The duty is to ensure that the electrical equipment is electrically safe. So you ask, what does that mean? So what that means is that the electrical equipment is free of risk of death, shock or injury from electricity. That risk has been eliminated or minimised so far as is reasonably practicable. Now, the big question is, what does reasonably practicable mean? Now, that can be a very complex question to answer. We look at things like what's known about the likelihood of the risk happening. Well, you have to say with electricity, that can be quite likely. The degree of harm that can arise from the hazard. As we all know, electricity is extremely dangerous, so a risk of death or serious injury by electrical shock can arise from an electrical hazard. What the person knows or should have known about the risk and the ways of eliminating or minimising the risk. We have to look at the availability of ways to eliminate or minimise the risk. Things like having your wiring checked by electrical contractors and fitting of safety switches are available ways of eliminating or minimising the risk. Last, and only after considering all of those other factors, you consider whether the cost of eliminating that risk is grossly disproportionate to the risk. What that doesn't mean is that you can say, well, I can't afford to fit a safety switch, therefore I don't have to do it. It doesn't mean that. It means regarding all the risks that are there, whether it's appropriate that those minimisation measures are taken. So what are the consequences of breaching that duty? We have three main offences under the Electrical Safety Act. The first is called a Category 1 offence, and that's the most serious offence that you can commit under the Electrical Safety Act. That is where a person who has a duty, say for instance a landlord, engages in conduct that recklessly exposes a person to whom they owe a duty to exposing that person to a risk of death or serious injury. What would be an example of that? Say for instance, as a landlord, your electrical contractor comes to you and says, look, the wiring in your property is really dangerous. Rats have chewed through your wiring in the ceilings. There's exposed copper wiring. The insulation is degraded. There's a very real risk of an electrical fire or someone being electrocuted in your property. There are no safety switches fitted, but the landlord says, yeah, I can't afford to do that right now, so she'll be right. I'll put a tenant in there and we'll worry about that down the track. Potentially, in those circumstances, you've committed a Category 1 offence under the Act. So the penalties, the maximum penalties for a Category 1 offence under the Act, for an individual is a maximum fine of $300,000 or 5 years imprisonment. Now, it's important to remember that the offence is committed through the exposure to risk. not the consequences of that risk. But I can tell you that if somebody was killed or seriously injured in those circumstances, a landlord could be looking at some real jail time in that scenario. For a corporation, the fine is $3 million, a maximum fine of $3 million. Quite often your accountant might advise you to own the property as a company, as say a trustee for a family trust. So the corporation itself would be liable for that maximum penalty. Further, a director of that company as an officer could be liable for a penalty of up to $600,000 fine or 5 years imprisonment as well. So the director has a duty to exercise due diligence to ensure that the corporation abides by its duty. Secondly, we have a Category 2 offence under the Act. That is where there's been a breach of that duty to ensure the electrical safety of the electrical equipment. And that breach exposes a person to a risk of death or serious injury. So once again, it's exposure to risk, not the consequences. So this offence could be committed even though nobody is actually injured. It's the exposure to risk which constitutes the offence. The maximum penalty for a Category 2 offence for an individual is a fine of up to $150,000. For a corporation, a fine of up to $1.5 million. And for a director as an officer of that company, a fine of up to $300,000. Thirdly, we have a Category 3 offence under the Act. And a Category 3 offence is constituted where somebody breaches that duty that we spoke about earlier. And there's not necessarily an exposure of any person to a risk of death or serious injury. So the maximum penalty for a Category 3 offence for an individual is a fine of $500,000. For a corporation, a fine of $500,000. Sorry, for an individual, $50,000. For a corporation, $500,000. And for a director of a company, a fine of up to $100,000. Tenants also have duties under the Electrical Safety Act as other persons under the Act. That is, they have to take reasonable care for their own electrical safety. They have to take reasonable care to ensure that their acts or omissions don't adversely affect the electrical safety of other persons, and to comply so far as they are able with any reasonable instruction given by a person in control of the electrical equipment, for example, the landlord. Now, what would be an example of a tenant breaching that duty? An extreme example would be, and unfortunately it's not unheard of, is tenants bypassing mains power board and safety switches to steal electricity from the grid. There's actually a case going on before a coroner in New South Wales at the moment where that's exactly what's happened, and unfortunately a young roofing worker replacing the roof, his boss thought he'd done the right thing and isolated the power. Unbeknown to him, persons unknown had bypassed that the mains power board. If at any time you suspect that might be the case, I would really urge you to contact your electricity entity, whether that be Ergon or Energex, and report it to the Electrical Safety Office. That's a very serious and very dangerous thing to do. Just before I go off the legal requirements, I'd just like to touch briefly on Section 85 of the Electrical Safety Regulation. What that requires is that if there's a general purpose socket outlet installed after the 1st of June 1992 and a tenancy agreement is entered into, the relevant circuit must have a safety switch installed. The penalty for breach of that regulation is a fine of up to $1,500 for an individual, or $7,500 for a corporation, or an on-the-spot fine of $300. I'd just like to touch briefly on some cases that either have been recently before the court or currently before the court. I don't want to speak in too much depth at the moment because the cases are either still under the appeal period or they're still before the court. The first case was a very tragic case which occurred in the last couple of years, where a tenant of a rental property was electrocuted by an electrically unsafe submersible water pump. That was a very tragic case where the water pump was found to have been electrically unsafe. In fact, it was quite dangerous, and that pump had been imported into Australia and purchased by another person. The importer of that water pump was found to be liable for that dangerous water pump. But tragically also, although there was a safety switch fitted to the premises, the safety switch wasn't attached to the circuit, which was an external circuit into which the pump had been plugged by means of a extension cord. Tragically, had that circuit been protected by a safety switch, it's almost certain that that young lady's life would have been saved. So that was a very tragic double failure, and I really can't urge upon you more earnestly to have safety switches installed to all your circuits, and certainly make sure they're fitted to all of the general purpose power outlets. The second case I want to talk about is a tenant in a commercial property who took it upon himself to undertake his own unlicensed and dangerous electrical work. That was like a warehouse type arrangement. The frame of that establishment was metal, and potentially that whole warehouse could have become live and placed not only himself, his workers, his customers potentially at risk, and but also all the other tenants and their customers and workers at risk. So please don't do your own unlicensed electrical work. It doesn't matter how competent you think you might be, just don't do it. In most circumstances, where you're renting out your property, the work done by a licensed electrical contractor will be tax deductible or depreciable. Really, it's not worth the risk of doing it yourself. The third case, which is a matter currently before the court, it involves a handyman in a flooded basement in commercial premises where there was electrical equipment located. That case highlights the importance of ensuring that when electrical equipment you think is decommissioned, please make sure that it's checked by a licensed electrical contractor. Don't just take the word of the seller of the property or a real estate agent. Say, yeah, mate, that's not live anymore. Make sure that's checked by a licensed electrical contractor. So I hope after all this that I haven't freaked you all out and you're not thinking, gee, I should go and sell all my rental properties and invest it somewhere else. What's required to comply with your duties It's really very simple, and I'll run through with you quickly now. Firstly, ensure, as Michael has said before, ensure that all your work is performed by a licensed electrical contractor. Very important. Make sure all the circuits, particularly the socket outlet circuits, are fitted with safety switches. Make sure all the electrical wiring, switchboard and appliances are confirmed as electrically safe before you first rent the property. Make sure all the electrical appliances you purchase for use with the tenants bear the regulatory compliance mark, and you'll see it on the slide there. It's a tick in a little circle in a triangle, and that'll make sure that the item is approved for sale and use in Queensland. So that's very important as well. I know there can be a tendency to want to get something cheap off the internet. It's not worth it. Make sure it has that mark, and if you're not sure, ask the person who's selling it to you for proof that it has that mark. Make sure all the safety switches are tested every 2 years by a licensed electrical contractor. That's not a legal requirement, but that's something that the Electrical Safety Office would recommend. Ask your tenant to check the safety switches are functioning by pushing the test button once every 3 months. When your agent or you go through and do your regular inspections, just check that any plug-in and fixed appliances and installations are okay. You can see on the slide there items such as an iron or a power cord which is frayed. Get rid of those appliances and buy new ones. Finally, please be guided by a licensed electrical contractor as to how often your electrical installations should be checked to ensure electrical safety. So if you comply with all of those requirements, you should be fine. You should have complied with the Electrical Safety Act. So that's all from me today. I'll hand you back to Chris. Thank you again for watching today.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you very much. As Paul has outlined, there are serious consequences for those who are non-compliant or commit offences under the Act. Hefty fines or the possibility of jail time. That is aside from the possibility of serious property damage, serious injury, and even death. So if we do the right thing, then we can avoid the risk of those things occurring. It is time now for us to have a panel session. The guys have moved over to their chairs and are ready to go. They've been pumped. I want to say thank you to everyone for joining us and also for your questions. Keep them coming through. If you haven't yet asked a question and either Paul or Michael have got the light bulb to go on and you want to ask a question, it's not too late. You can just type in your name and the question. We'll get to it, time permitting, to as many as we can. Are we ready, gentlemen?
Ready.
Ready. Okay. Well, I can see the first one is to Michael, and it's from Robin. Thanks for joining us, Robin. Are electricians required while on site to identify if safety switches are not installed to notify the owner? That's part one. And how do I know if I even have a safety switch?
Okay. So for part one of that, an electrician does have an obligation to make sure that any issues identified, they do notify the owner and let them know exactly what's going on. And definitely they should be notifying you if there's no safety switches installed, mostly for your best interest and their best interest as well, because that's obviously an important piece of information that they need to know, especially if it's on a rental property, because obviously it's a requirement, so under law. So they should definitely be advising you of that. And in regards to safety switches, so they're they can look very similar to a circuit breaker a lot of times, especially with the single poles. They're a little unit, the same as a circuit breaker. The significant difference, though, there's a test button. So there's a little button somewhere that may be on the front of that.
Yep.
So as those pictures showed, that has a T.
Yep.
So so the safety switch has that test button, and you hit that, and that makes sure that it works properly.
All right. You say, or the ESO says, we recommend it on all the circuits.
Yes.
So what do you say to the people who say, well, I've got one installed and I've got one and I've got a circuit breaker, I'm good?
Well,
all good.
Yeah, that'll protect your equipment, all the other circuit breakers, and it's about covering all of your circuits. So if you've got one, it may cover your power points, and that's about it. So how do you know that if something goes with the hot water system or the stove, or it may be that it has metal contact parts, someone is not going to get electrocuted from that as well if that goes wrong?
So that's a false sense of security. That I've got one and I'm good. All my sockets are covered. I'm good.
That's right. Yeah, because as I said, the circuit breaker will protect the equipment fault, but it won't protect the person.
Okay, that's good advice, and that's good to know. That's good to know. Another question. Thanks for joining us again and putting in your questions. This is from Sally. This is to you, Paul. What are the requirements for rental properties in unit or apartment blocks?
Okay, well, basically the requirements are exactly the same. You have the same duties for the electrical circuits, appliances within the unit that you own. The difference, though, is that there is also electrical equipment in the common property areas. It might be things like air conditioning units, external lights. The body corporate for the apartment block or the unit block will have that duty to ensure that equipment is electrically safe. You, as a landlord, may actually be on the body corporate committee. The one thing I can suggest, though, for a body corporate is that's a commercial premises, so they can give that responsibility to a third party. I'd recommend that most body corporates engage a licensed electrical contractor and give him the responsibility of maintaining the electrical equipment on the common property.
Again, great advice. Another one for you, Tomo. This is from Chris. Advised there was a requirement of something to be rectified under ESR. There's still no action happening. The tenant is a friend. What course can you advise? What can happen here?
I assume that's the electrical safety regulation, that is ESR. So I assume that they're advised by an electrician. So if you're still required to be rectified, it's a dangerous situation. I suppose I should clarify here. So electrical safety, we look after electrical safety matters that are dangerous or electrically related. If it is an actual contractual issue, then that's the Office of Fair Trading. So if there's actually something going wrong with it, it's not what you paid for, then that's the Office of Fair Trading. If it's electrically unsafe, then it is us, and we need to know about it. So if that happens and there's a situation where the equipment is faulty or it's unsafe in that manner, then you need to report it to the Electrical Safety Office. And
look, I would imagine if it's a grey area, because there, between agencies, there's it's hard to define whose is what. Even if they contacted us and it wasn't ours, we would then forward them on to the appropriate agency. Is that?
Them, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So don't sit back and think, oh, I'm not sure, or do nothing.
No, don't second guess.
All right, another one for you, Tomo. This is from Stephen. This relates to me too. I've recently put in solar. It's working fantastic. It's pretty new. But what do you consider regular maintenance on solar PV? 6 months, 12 months? And what is maintenance? Is maintenance, if I get up there with Windex on top of my roof and clean my panels, haven't I maintained?
Preferably not. So when you got your system installed, the installer is required by law to actually give you a maintenance schedule. So you'll have a set of maintenance requirements, such as electrical connections, cleaning the panels, and that will all have timeframes related to it. Now, we would consider probably 12 months for electrical connections at a minimum. Cleaning may be more often. Now, that depends on obviously where you live, what's around you, so whether there's dust, roadworks, whatever it may be. So that's all relative to the climate, I guess, of where you live as well. Obviously, up north, you may need a bit more because it's pretty extreme up there, especially when you get big cyclones or rainstorms. So But yeah, that maintenance schedule that the installer has given you will guide you on that as well. So.
All right, let's go back to a legal question. Paul, over to you from Melanie. What are the legal requirements when buying and selling properties?
Okay. Firstly, a seller of a property is obliged to notify the purchaser before they go into possession whether or not the property has a safety switch. And that advice has to be in writing. Now, normally that's contained in the standard REIQ contract, and your agent will answer that question for you in the contract. Secondly, the seller has an obligation to notify the regulator of the Electrical Safety Act of a number of things about identifying the property, but also advising whether or not the property has a safety switch. So, and that's required before possession is transferred. Now, normally that's included in the documents that you sign, that's signed in the normal conveyancing process. So you don't need to worry about that. When you sign that document, that'll be sent to the Electrical Safety Office. Thirdly, if a safety switch is not fitted in the property, then the buyer has an obligation within 90 days to fit a safety switch to the socket outlet circuits.
You touched on this, Tomo, in your presentation. And this is a question from John. And John, thanks for joining us. If I get a tingle from a tap and it's reported, who do I notify and will I be charged?
No, it's a free service, so you need to notify your electricity entity. So there are actually a few around the state.
Yep.
So we have Energex, who looks after South East Queensland, so the Sunshine Coast to Gatton and Esk.
Yep.
We have Essential Energy, which is in Goondiwindi area, and then we have Ergon for basically the rest of Queensland. And Ergon is actually also a retailer, but in Weipa we have it's the mine up there, so Rio Tinto, I think, is the entity up there. So just be aware of where they roughly are. I'm sure if you do actually call one and they can advise you anyhow, so it's no fuss. They'll advise you who the correct entity is, and it's free of charge, so they'll come out and check because it's all about making sure their network is safe.
Right. And should you report that immediately?
Yes.
Is that a matter of urgency?
Absolutely. You should not hesitate to call them and get them out straight away, especially if you receive that. As I said, it's basically a case of life and death.
Yep. And
if it's reported to you by your tenant, and tell them to not touch any other metal fitting within that installation.
Just quickly, and we're running out of time, what do you say to the person that says, well, it's only a little tingle, it's only a minor tingle, I'll get to it in time? Well,
a minor tingle can turn into a big shock and can kill you, so... it's very, very quick, and it may just be the circumstances where there's still a lot of electricity flowing through that piece of equipment, but you might just not hit the right circumstances where it will kill you.
Again, thanks to everyone who put in questions. Unfortunately, we're running out of time, and this is our last one. This is from Brian, and it's to you, Michael. How often should I test my safety switches? Right, so I've done the right thing. I've got them installed, or you, Butte. Most people, or some people, don't even know what they look like, and we've touched on that already. But do I need an electrician to do it? Will that give me peace of mind, or should it be just me going to test it?
Well, it's a bit of both. So I know it can be difficult sometimes to get people to test them, especially your tenants, to do the push-button test, because the push-button test will make sure it's actually operating. So we do that every 3 months once they get their power bill. And it's about their own safety, as I said before. So, but when you get your smoke alarms tested, get your electrician to test it. Make sure that it's working properly. Actually, with a time test and a piece of equipment they test it with can tell them it's tripping properly and it's doing it within the set time period for that device, because they are built to a certain standard, so they need to maintain that. So they're both things that need to be done. And don't just take this away for your rental properties. This is all good information that you should take to your own house, and really that everyone should know. You should be doing it in your own house as well to make sure they work.
And these are the types of messages that the ESO is trying to get out into the broader community, not just into the property market.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. We might leave it there. It's a great way to wind up proceedings. I'd like to, on behalf of the ESO and OAR, thank our guest presenters and panellists today, Michael Thompson and Paul Waltham. I'd like to thank you for your company today. I hope it's been informative. Look, we're going to have a series of these, similar events like this, digital, coming your way in the not too distant future. But for today, this was our first webinar on electrical safety in rental properties. Again, I hope you enjoyed it. Today's webinar was recorded and will be available to watch on demand at electricalsafety.qld.gov.au. Give us a bit of time to get that up there, and you can review bits and pieces, maybe do a bit more homework, and you can also find at our website other resources and information on general electrical safety. I just want to remind, while I've got an opportunity, electricians and electrical contractors who might have joined us today to get a bit of information on rental properties, that Electrical Safety Week is on from the 7th to the 11th of September, and I'll invite them to join us on the 9th of September for a live electrical contractor webinar. You'll hear from people like footy legend Matt Rogers, who will be joining us on that occasion, and you'll get the latest advice on safety in the electrical industry. Shortly, we'll email those of you who registered for today's event a feedback survey. We'd really value your feedback, so if you could spare us around 5 minutes, that'd be fantastic. Just complete it and send it back to us, and this will help us improve future events. Again, thanks for joining us for our first Electrical Safety in Rental Properties webinar. As I said, the ESO will have more similar digital events in the not too distant future, including that electrical contractors webinar coming up in early next month. On behalf of Donna, Michael and Paul, I leave you with one final message, and I think they all touched on this. It is our job to remember that electricity is invisible and silent and is a killer, or can be a killer, and it really rarely gives a second chance. Again, thanks for joining us. We'll see you in the not too distant future. Bye for now.